Okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Can you see me? I apologize for the delay, but it's good to be here with you, even though I can't see you. We can't physically be together at the moment. I really appreciate the fact that many of you are here today. And I apologize for the technical difficulties. Despite how young I may look, this is actually my first time going live in any form. So I hope you can forgive the last minute scrambling to get on. So welcome. I'm so glad that so many of you were here, that so many of you are interested in our jazz theory online class. This class is really my baby in many ways. And it is the fruit of a little more than 12 years of teaching jazz to students of all ages and all skill levels. And it's really designed for these students who I've met. So let me tell you a little bit about myself first, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the class. I may put my prop, the guitar here, down. It's a little bit Bruce Springsteen syndrome, having a guitar as a comfort object of sorts. You can also tell that I make jokes sometimes when I'm talking into a computer, as the case may be at the moment here. So my name is Gary Prince. I am a jazz guitarist. I am the jazz program chair at Levine Music. I've been at Levine since 2008, and I've been jazz program chair since 2013. At Levine, if you're not familiar with us, we are a large community music school serving the entire region in suburban Maryland, with campuses at the Strathmore and at the new Silver Spring Library, in Northwest DC with our campus on Upton Street, in Southeast DC with our campus at the Arc, and in Virginia with our campus at the Westover Church in Arlington, right by Falls Church. So at Levine, generally, we take all ages, all skill levels, all musical interests, from very young kids all the way up, every style of music, every instrument. In the jazz program specifically, our goal is to reach the entire community, to introduce everybody to jazz, regardless of their instrument, their skill level, their previous experiences with it, whether or not music is their primary focus, and also to meet them at the time commitment that they can make to music, which is part of what Jazz Theory Online is about. So we take all ages, all skill levels. We offer ensembles, both large and small, from age 11 through adults. We also offer regular workshop type classes like beginning jazz piano, and other short duration and longer duration instrument specific or style specific workshops, as well as a large choir, the Capital City Voices at Levine, run by the great jazz pianist and educator Wayne Wylance. So I really like to think that we have a little bit of something for everybody. And the guiding lights for me are, and for our program generally, are inclusion and community, creating a strong community of learners, a strong community of music lovers and of teachers, and getting everyone to feel included, feel like jazz is something that is for them, because it is something that is for everybody. It is America's great art music, and it is for all of us, and it is something that all of us can participate in. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about our program. As we're going through the live stream tonight, if at any point you have any questions, please put them in the YouTube comments. I'm going to reserve a little bit of time at the end of the session to do a bit of a Q&A and a talk back. Since we're a couple minutes late, we'll probably go a few minutes past 7:45, and we'll see how it goes. And I should mention too, I'm very pleased to say that in addition to Jazz Theory Online, we have successfully moved all of our jazz offerings, including private lessons and group classes, online for the duration of this crisis that we are currently in. And we would love to have you joining us anytime. So a little bit about Jazz Theory Online. as I said, I developed jazz theory online over the course of last year. The class went live, as it were, last July for the first time. I designed this course out of a desire to have a resource to teach our students the nuts and bolts of jazz improvisation, uh, based on what I see as a lack in the market of something that's appropriate to the kinds of students who we typically see, which and especially towards adult amateur jazz students, students who might have a long history of listening to jazz, a long history of playing their instruments, but maybe have not yet studied the music in a very formal way. So that's really the profile of the student for whom this class is intended. Someone who is an adult or perhaps a teenager as well, who has a basic background on their instrument, can get around the instrument, and also a basic understanding of music theory, by which I mean the ability to read music, the ability to read a little bit of treble clef, a little bit of bass clef, a basic understanding of how scales work, how to find scales, how key signatures work, and a basic understanding of what chords are, and how to make simple chords. So for people with that background, and especially people who've listened to jazz, the idea behind this course is that it will fill in all of the gaps. And it will answer a lot of the lingering questions that people have, and generally demystify jazz music and jazz improvisation. This class is also appropriate for people who have never been into jazz before, who are getting into jazz for the first time. Throughout the course, there is a lot of listening, a lot of exposure to jazz standards. So for those people, this is a good way to start to get their head around, or their ears around, the repertoire a little bit, and find their way into the music, really. So I feel like I should start by defining a little bit what jazz theory is. It's kind of a funny term. If you've ever studied jazz in like a collegiate setting, it's actually not especially common to have a class specifically called jazz theory. The standard track in a college setting, besides, of course, jazz ensemble, jazz combo, would be what we'd call a jazz improvisation course, right? So jazz improvisation in that context really means like hands-on learning the music, learning repertoire, and playing and applying it. But the difference is that, unlike in an ensemble, you're not building towards a recital. You're not necessarily working on playing together as a group. Instead, you are working on the nuts and bolts of the music, the scales, chord progressions, general knowledge that you need to play in the context of songs and on your instrument. So I've called this course Jazz Theory because, by virtue of being online, we need to have a way to differentiate it a little bit, right? So this course is more about learning those nuts and bolts of the music, trying to understand those nuts and bolts of the music, not removed from the instrument, but in a way that's not instrument specific, that's not dependent on live playing. So the idea is that this course can be a supplement to private lessons, a supplement to being an ensemble. It can also be a prerequisite to being in an ensemble for someone who truly feels like they need more information in order to get themselves started and in order to jump in there. But I think the place where it really shines is as a supplement to being involved in private lessons, as a supplement to being involved in an ensemble. And by virtue of being online, it gives some time for the kind of drills and kind of extra instrumental skills that the student needs to develop that there often isn't the time to go over in an ensemble, or even the time to go over necessarily in a private lesson. So jazz theory, when I'm referring to jazz theory, what I'm referring to are a way of understanding, a way of codifying what musical devices or musical objects appear regularly in the music, right? In my preparation to creating this class, I polled a lot of adult jazz students at Levine, and two general responses came up that I thought were really interesting. On the one hand, um, there was a strong contingent of people who felt that jazz is uniquely difficult among musics, more difficult than pop or rock music, more difficult than classical music. And two, there were a number of people who expressed a variation of the opinion that jazz and jazz improvisation can't be taught, that it has to be intuited on some level, or that learning jazz it really depends on some kind of innate ability, especially jazz improvisation. Um, I believe very strongly that neither of those things are fundamentally true. I believe that jazz can be learned by anybody. Anybody can become a great improviser. And I also don't believe that jazz is uniquely more challenging than any other form of music. But it may be, for people who are coming at it from the outside, a little bit more mystifying. Um, so, jazz theory as a field is a very young thing. Certainly, as many people may be aware, the earlier jazz musicians, especially the musicians of the 20s, 30s, 40s, very typically did not receive formal schooling in jazz. They received their schooling in the community setting by playing with one another, by performing, by apprenticing with master musicians. And I think in many cases, for some of these musicians, they did understand the nuts and bolts of the music, but they may have understood these nuts and bolts in a slightly different way than necessarily naming, well, this chord is containing these notes, this scale is containing these notes, this chord and this scale go together. They may have understood those nuts and bolts in a way more like, well, this is a device that I can use when I hear this sound or in this context. That's a really good way to learn. It's a really powerful way to learn. However, as the music matured, became more sophisticated, as more and more jazz musicians sought more and more formal education, especially in the post-war era, taking advantage of the GI Bill, many of the great jazz composers like John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and many others took advantage of that as a way to get higher education in music. And as the music became to be recognized and appreciated more widely as an art form rather than a form of dance entertainment, the music became much more sophisticated. And also the knowledge of the musicians became much more sophisticated to fit with that. And so it's in that period, in the late 50s, throughout the 60s, when you start to see this idea of jazz theory emerging as a topic. So when I talk about jazz theory, I'm defining that as understanding, looking at a lot of music, looking at improvised solos, looking at compositions that were created by jazz musicians, and also looking at compositions that are played by jazz musicians, such as a lot of the great American songbook songs, which were originally composed for theater and then became these vehicles for jazz improvisation. Looking at all of this music and trying to understand what are the commonalities, what are the things that musicians keep doing, and how can I learn to recognize them by ear and by eye, and then using that recognition, becoming able to repeat these things, create these things ourselves. So when I talk about jazz theory, I'm talking about melody, sequences of single notes that create melodies, whether improvised or composed, harmony, groups of chords, right? A chord being a group of several notes, three or more notes that supports the melody, rhythms, so specific idiomatic use of rhythm, right? Jazz is defined in many ways by the use of swing rhythms and syncopation. Form. Form means what happens when in a song, the order of events. It's a very important thing in jazz because many jazz songs are based on what we call standard forms, predictable, repeating sets of chords that occur over a specific amount of time. And then finally, performance practice. So performance practice means typically when you start a song, you do this. When you end a song, you do this. The order of events in the song tend to follow in this order. So once again, that's melody, single notes, scales, harmony, chords, progressions of chords, rhythm, syncopation, swing, also feel, groove, form, right? That's order of events within a performance or a song, and then performance practice, right? What do the musicians typically do? So my goal in creating something called Jazz Theory Online is to touch all of these. And this is the thing that I really have seen lacking in a lot of the jazz theory textbooks or jazz books that you might find on the market. Most of them deal almost exclusively with melody and harmony, and most of them are written for a college level audience. So this class is really created for an audience that might have more holes in their knowledge of music, an audience that might be relatively beginner in their knowledge of music theory. So the goal of Jazz Theory Online is if you take this course, you come out having a better understanding of these things, you come out feeling like you understand how to begin with improvisation. You're able to look at a jazz standard, most typical jazz standards, and know what's going on. You're able to look at it and know what the chords are doing, what the melody are doing. You're able to, on some level, compare it to other jazz standards and see their similarities. And you have some sense of how to then realize that music. Specifically realizing music from a lead sheet, like you might see in the Real Book, which is a publication of jazz lead sheets, kind of a form of shorthand for learning the most commonly performed jazz pieces, and generally give you all of the skills needed to play and improvise in a jazz combo setting. So a small setting where players are realizing music and improvising from typically lead sheet, shorthand type arrangements. Again, I'd like to invite you, if at any point you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I am going to leave a little bit of time for a Q&A and a sort of talk back, a very one-sided talk back. I'll be the only one talking, but I'll read your comments, and we'll do a little bit of that at the end. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of the units. To that end, I have put the syllabus for Jazz Theory Online in the comments of the YouTube section. It's there in PDF form. Anybody can download it. The syllabus document also includes a section called Getting Started, which provides a detailed overview of the way the class runs in the Music First platform. That's the platform that we're using to deliver this class. So it contains a detailed explanation of how the platform works, what tools are available in it, what kind of assignments and tests and quizzes to expect. And then going down a little bit in there, we have the syllabus. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to attempt to screen share now so that you can see what the class looks like. Give me just one moment. So I'm looking at the class overview page. So this follows with the syllabus. So what you're seeing now, you're seeing the class overview page. When you log in for the class, when you sign up for the class, you'll see this. Something that's fundamental about the class, one is that it can be begun at any time and it can be completed at any rate. I do personally do the grading for the class. I personally provide feedback, but there are no deadlines. Once you sign up for the class, you have a long period of time to complete it, and you can sign up at any time. And then once you're in the class, the units, of which there are 15, can be completed in any order. So this class is designed to accommodate people who are interested in going in order, progressing from one topic to the next topic to the next topic, as well as for people who are interested in jumping around a little bit, filling in the gaps in their knowledge. Because especially what I've discovered in working with a lot of amateur jazz musicians is that some of them might be really well versed in some areas and really not well versed in other areas. So the class could take a beginner, someone totally new to jazz, who has basic music theory knowledge, through the course in order. It could also accommodate jumping around. Also, although there are assignments and quizzes throughout, which I'll talk a little bit more about a little in a moment, they are all optional. It's also fine for people who really just want to sample the different sections. Maybe at some point we'll later want to come through and do the assessment, but there's no risk of getting stuck in Unit 2 and then not being able to proceed. So when you look at the overview, and this tracks with the syllabus in the document that I referenced, there's a little bit of a pre-unit. It contains a note just about the terminology that I use for referring to musical devices, and a very brief review on reading a lead sheet for people who are unfamiliar with that. So again, a lead sheet is a form of shorthand that you might see. Specifically in the real book, that's the most common source that musicians have, but in other sources as well. So like this example from that pre-unit shows an example of a lead sheet. So the pre-unit goes into detail about understanding reading chord symbols, which you see up above the notation, versus reading notation, understanding things like a first and a second ending, rehearsal markings like letter A, B, and then things like this, these are called rhythm slashes. So how to interpret these symbols for people who are more used to reading music where everything is notated, as is common in classical music, and even some big band music. It would be important to have this refresher to understand what you're looking at, because most of the course is going to use lead sheets. And again, lead sheets are the most common way in which jazz music is performed. The through line for Jazz Theory Online for me is the blues. Again, this is something that I feel is really missing in a lot of jazz education, is the primacy of the blues. The blues is absolutely at the core of jazz, of everything jazz. Jazz and blues are hand in glove. They are the same musics. There are differences in instrumentation. There are regional differences within the US. There are differences within different historical periods in the style. And there are certainly big differences in sophistication. The way that someone like John Coltrane plays a blues is different in some respects from the way that someone like B.B. King plays a blues, but the fundamentals are the same. And I think any jazz education that doesn't start with the blues is really doing something wrong, to make kind of a bold statement here. So I begin by talking about blues harmony. This is, again, returning to this idea of form. When we talk about blues, we have both a set of musical values, and then we have blues as an actual objective musical form, a specific relationship of chords appearing in a specific order. A huge swath of the jazz repertoire is based on the blues form, taking that harmony, which again appears, the chords have specific relationships to one another and appear for specific durations in a specific order, taking that form and applying variations to it, creating new melodies on top of it, and improvising on it using different levels of sophistication, different scales and melodic devices. But that form is really fundamental to a huge portion of the jazz repertoire, both songs that are blues forms and songs that are not. So in a little later, we will, I might take you through that first unit so that we can see and we can talk a little bit more about that. So I start by talking about the blues form, blues harmony. Each unit culminates in either a test or an assignment, or in some cases both. Tests are automatically graded, so you do them and you submit, and then you can immediately see what you got right or got wrong. Tests, most of them are multiple choice or short answer. This is one of the really critical things to do to be able to succeed in understanding jazz improvisation in a lot of different contexts, is have a very quick recall for a lot of musical devices, such as being able to quickly identify the notes in a given chord or a given scale. So this is, I think, one of the great assets of this class, is being able to do that in this kind of test setting where you can quickly get feedback and do a lot of that kind of drilling that there isn't time for in lessons or in ensembles. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. There are also questions that are aural in nature, meaning that you'll hear an example and you'll be asked to identify it by ear. A big part of music theory is learning to identify devices by ear. Unless you're born with absolute pitch, or sometimes called perfect pitch, most of us can't learn to listen to something and identify the specific notes, but we can learn to listen to something and identify the relationships. So you can learn to identify by ear a scale, a certain sequence of notes, sequences of chords, and that's one of the big goals of this. So from blues harmony, we move to talking about blues melody. By that, I mean the scales that are associated with blues, the blues scale, which is where most beginning improvisers begin. But I also mean common forms that melodies take the form of in blues songs, typical orders in which things appear. From there, we talk a little bit about jazz rhythm. Again, something that is often missing from jazz theory courses, jazz theory books. The idiomatic use of rhythm is absolutely a critical element of jazz. Jazz does not, you can use all the right notes, all the right chords. Jazz will not sound like jazz unless you are expressing the rhythm in the right way. Sorry, not in the right way. I was distracted for a moment, but in the way that's common to the music. And that includes issues of feel and swing, as well as actual rests and attacks and durations. From there, we talk about chord constructions, chord extensions, chord scale relationships. This is getting at kind of the center of what most people think about when they refer to jazz theory, which are the relationships between chords and scales. So when we have chords, a chord is a sequence of 3, 4, or more notes played simultaneously. Chords support melody. So the fundamental idea of jazz theory, which was really codified in the late 50s and in the 60s, people like Jamie Ambersold had a big influence on this, as well as George Russell, Lenny Tristano, David Baker. It's this idea that when you play a specific chord, you have a specific scale or a specific set of notes that go with it. So for example, if I play this chord, B flat major 7, the B flat major scale goes with it. So as an improviser, if I hear that chord being played, or I see somebody play that chord, or see that on a piece of music, I know the corresponding scale is. That's just one very simple example. So the class progresses by first reviewing how the most commonly used chords in jazz are spelled, meaning what notes appear in them and how those notes are related to one another. Those being major 7, dominant 7, minor 7, minor 7 flat 5, and diminished 7. And then talking about what additional notes can we add on top of the chord to make them sound more jazzy, right? So we have this idea that's almost unique to jazz, certainly unique to jazz as compared to pop music or rock music, that if I play a chord, that's nice. Let's add some other notes to it that are going to enhance the sound. So for example, that's the 9th, that's the 13th, that's the raised 11th. So it gives more options. It doesn't change the fundamental nature of the chord, but it gives more options. And a big part of sounding idiomatic or sounding appropriate in jazz is using those kinds of extensions. So we talk about chords, we talk about the ways in which the chords can be enhanced, and then we talk about the scales that relate to the chords. That's kind of the bulk of most jazz theory that people refer to. However, I try to go a little bit farther, because when you start with that, it gets you playing all the right notes, but it doesn't necessarily get you sounding like jazz. So from there, we move to kind of the other, we step out for a moment and move to the other big track in this course, which is jazz harmony. So that's understanding sequences of chords. One of the fundamental ideas of music theory generally is looking at groups of chords and identifying how the chords relate to one another. We do that by assigning numbers to each chord relative to that chord's position in the scale that it came out of. Now, if you don't understand what that means, don't worry about it. It's covered in the course. But the idea is, when we have groups of chords, what we call progressions of chords, we can learn to identify by ear and also identify by looking how those chords are related to one another. In any form of music, we have typical chord progressions that occur over and over again. A really good analogy is language, right? Within a specific language, or even just within a specific dialect of a language, you have certain constructions that will appear over and over again, certain idioms of speech, ways in which sentences are constructed, things of that nature that make it possible for us to understand one another, and also prevent us from having to reinvent the wheel with language. Jazz and all forms of music are the same way. Part of the thing that makes a form of music a specific form of music is that it has these specific orders in which things tend to appear. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to appear in that order. That's why it is music theory. Music theory gives us some idea of what might happen, which we can then test. Everybody, just by virtue of listening to music, you develop a set of expectations, a set of ideas about what's likely to happen in melody and in harmony. Music theory is about making those ideas explicit. When you make those ideas explicit, it's easy to learn many songs because they're all made of the same stuff. And it's easy to improvise on songs because you can understand what they are made of. Similarly, then, it's easy to compose, and it's more interesting when you notice something that defies your expectations. And someone might say, as you go through this class, there's always exceptions to all of the rules that I have in here. Those exceptions are defying the expectations. So what I do is we move progressively through the most common chord progressions that we see in jazz, starting with the 2-5-1 chord progression, which sounds like this in B flat. Just to be very brief. Then we move into the 3-6-2-5-1 chord progression, which I think should be very recognizable by ear. There are many, many songs, jazz songs, pop songs, kid songs, that use that progression. It underlies many of our jazz standards, if not most. From there, we move on to other common chord progressions that we commonly see. So the goal is to really fill out the knowledge and understanding of what happens in the standard jazz repertoire. returning to the blues in Unit 10, we talk about applying some of these variations to the blues form specifically in the way that jazz musicians do. Then using this knowledge, combining that harmony knowledge with the knowledge that we already have developed about scales and chords, we learn how to create a walking bass line. One of the defining features of jazz is that the bass player is often walking, playing 4 beats to the bar. When they are doing that, the bass player is outlining the chords, outlining the harmony in kind of a specific idiomatic way that makes use of the notes in the chords and the scales related to them. So regardless of whether or not you are a bass player, being able to create a walking bass line creates a level of understanding of the music that is critical. From there, we move on to what I've called altered dominance. That's referring to a specific type of chord, which is a dominant 7th chord, and adding alterations to it. Again, like this idea of chord extensions, adding notes that create more of a sense of tension and release. One of the recurring ideas of jazz and jazz theory is about creating tension and release, whether it's rhythmic tension and release, melodic tension and release, or harmonic tension and release. So really, that's the topic that I get into in this unit, is how to create some of that melodic tension and release. From there, we talk about chromaticism and melody. Chromaticism or chromatics are the use of notes that are not in the scale as a way to dress up the notes that are. Again, a way to make them sound jazzy. This is where we get idiomatic. So to return to my previous example, B flat major 7, B flat major scale, one of the things that makes it sound jazzy is not playing the scale on its own or playing the arpeggio on its own, but using some devices to get into the notes. So that note is a chromatic note leading into a note that is in the scale. Those things are a big part of what makes the music sound jazzy. Throughout all of these units, we reference standard songs, we reference improvised solos. There is analysis of these things, and each unit has an attached Spotify playlist where every song that's referenced in the unit is there to be listened to. And that's a crucial part of this, is listening. From there, we return to jazz harmony, again looking at a few less common chord progressions, but again with the goal of filling out our knowledge of the standard jazz repertoire. So we're not getting into any crazy Chick Corea tunes or anything here, but giving us the skills to understand a tune like My Romance or There Will Never Be Another You, as well as rhythm changes, blues, and know what's going on in there. And then the final unit takes all of those harmony ideas and again looks at them in the form of the blues, looking at what is sometimes called bird blues, bird referring to the great alto saxophonist and composer Charlie Parker, looking at the way that he would take the blues progression and modify it using all of the devices that we've learned, and then looking at a concept called guide tone lines, which is a way of understanding how to move single notes through a chord progression. So that covers the 15 units of the class. The idea is that, the 15 units are like our 15-week classes. Each unit might take an hour or so to go through, depending on how thoroughly you go through it, how many notes you take. Each assignment or a test might take a student between 40 minutes and an hour, depending on how well they've digested the material in the unit. And that's the idea. And if some of the things in the later units sound like they don't make sense, I promise all is revealed as you go through. So let me just show you a couple of the things in the first and second units, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A. So if you look at the first unit, this is what it actually looks like on the student side. So we have a reference to the Spotify playlist. So if I click that, it'll open in its own window, and we can listen to the songs that appear in the unit. And then we have a lot of text. So in some ways, it's similar to a textbook in that way. And then we have a lot of notation examples. So this is about identifying the 3 chords that are most common in the blues in different keys. And then kind of throughout, we have audio examples. Some of these were created in MIDI. Some of them were created by me or my colleagues either at the piano or at the guitar. So I don't know how well you can hear that, but the idea is that throughout, we are always tying the ear and the eye because it's very, very important to listen to these things. If you only keep these things on the page, you won't really be understanding it. So we move through more examples. Again, we have audio as well as different forms of notation, discussion of common variations on the blues, examples of common devices that occur. So these are just common licks that might happen in the blues. It might happen in a jazz setting. Again, this speaks a little bit to the performance practice element. What do other musicians expect you to do on the bandstand when you're playing a specific tune? Unit 1 goes on to talk about minor blues, and then you can see at the bottom there's a link to the test. So if we open up the test, it is multiple choice. So here, let me open up someone's test who they already submitted it. So you can see we'll have a lot of questions that are multiple choice or short answer. This is what it looks like on the student side after you've done the test. So it'll tell you what you got right, what you got wrong, and it gives an opportunity to drill a lot of these skills that are really very needed. So then as we get into Unit 2, we actually do have an assignment here. Assignments are created in Noteflight. So I'm going to open that up just so that you can see it. So all of the assignments for the class, let's see, I'll open up an example that a student made here. So there's an area where I can add comments to it. There's a prompt, and then you can open the software. And what it does is it generates a blank template where you can then add notes, change notes, and in this case, compose an original blues melody, which you can then listen back to. So Jeffrey, if you happen to be on here, my apologies for sharing your business with everybody, but you did a great job. So this is an example of a really good example from a student. So in the template of this unit, the original template, which I'm sorry, I can't pull up at the moment apparently, I started by entering just the chord symbols in the bass line, and then the student was tasked with spelling each chord, typing in the notes, individual notes of each chord. And then I also wrote in a specific rhythm just on one note. And then the task was to, using the blues scale and using specific ideas about what the blues form should be, modifying each note head to create an original melody. So let's listen back to what Jeffrey created. So that's the case for most of the assignments that are throughout the course. It's usually a composition assignment. And then those I grade personally and will submit comments on. And there's the opportunity to modify them and tweak them into something that you can really use. Depending on the unit, there may be more or less scaffolding, meaning in this first one, I gave a lot of information. The whole bass line is written out. What each chord should be is written out. The whole rhythm is written out. All the student needs to do is move the note heads around and type in the notes in the chord. Later on, there might be less information. So that's a very brief overview of the course. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope that you've gotten something out of it. I'll now take a minute to answer some questions. It looks like there are a couple questions there. If anyone has any additional questions, please put them in the comments section. and I'll be able to see them. And also, if at any point you have any questions, my email address is gprince, that's GPRINCE at levinemusic.org. Feel free to email me anytime. I'd love to have you in the class. So let me look at this first question. Bennett asks, can you talk about why jazz theory, compared to classical music theory, seems to require so much more knowledge of chord extensions, if that's the right chord, i.e. seventh chords, ninth chords, etc.? That's a good question, Bennett. The truth is that jazz doesn't really require that more so than classical theory does necessarily. Seventh chords and chord extensions appear extensively in classical theory as well, but they appear in a very, very different way. And I think the thing that you might be responding to is that, especially depending on the era of classical music that you're listening to, I think overall in jazz, those kinds of extended chords are much more common, and they are much more part of the standard repertoire and the standard expectations for what things should sound like than might be the case if you grew up listening to Bach or Mozart, who don't use those kinds of chords very extensively. And that's just part of the nature of the music. It's the same reason why jazz utilizes swing rhythms and the opera does not. It's part of the nature of the music. It's part of the nature of the sound. And I think it comes from, I think one of the through lines in jazz is taking popular music, taking popular songs, taking chords and musical forms, and musicians asking themselves, how can I make this more interesting? Right? And a surefire way to make a chord more interesting is to add some extensions on it. So why play this when you can do this? It's much more hip, and that's a big part of the sound. Next question from Femby. Once you complete the class, how long will you continue to have access to the class? So completing the class does not end your access to the class. I believe everybody who signs up has access to the class for a period of 6 months. That's my understanding. I might need to double check that, but it's a very long, very open-ended period. And even if you complete all of the assignments and everything, you don't lose your access. Once you complete a unit, you don't lose access to it. You continue to have access, so you can come back to it as much as you want, as often as you want. A question from Reginald. How much do you get into chords beyond the seventh chords in this course? We go pretty far. I go pretty far. So the first unit starts with just the basic seventh chords, and then we get into all of what I consider to be the most common sort of unaltered extensions. That is things like the 9th, the 11th, the 13th, sounds that make the chord sound more sophisticated but don't necessarily add a lot of tension. So again, that sort of sound. Also the 6th. And then we get into, in the altered dominant sections, I go pretty deep into the extensions that really create a lot of tension. So flat 9, sharp 9, flat 13, sharp 11. So things like this. And I talk quite extensively about the scales that are associated with each of those chords, building off of the earlier unit where we take the basic chords and assign scales to them based on the notes in those chords. So yes, it does go quite deep. And there's a discussion as well about chords that are built in fourths, which is something that's idiomatic to a lot of modal jazz of the 60s. So it goes as deep as you need to go to be able to play really all of the standard jazz repertoire. Question from Reginald. I'm sorry. Do you recommend a keyboard for this class? You do not have to be able to play keyboard for this class. On the understanding that keyboard is kind of the universal instrument for understanding music. In the discussion about chords and chord extensions, I teach basic piano voicings, simple one and two-handed piano voicings, because that is the best way to understand jazz harmony, is to see it and hear it visually at the keyboard. But no, you do not need to have a keyboard. You do not need to have any experience using a keyboard. Those sections, while helpful, are not, it's not going to dramatically hurt your understanding if you can't play a keyboard or you don't have a keyboard. And in fact, I myself am a pretty lousy keyboard player. So no, it's not essential, but it is a part of it. And if you are able to practice some of these things on the keyboard, it will really take your understanding of it to the next level. Comment from Richard. Tell us about your guitar. Thank you, Richard. I'm so glad you asked. This is a 1951 Epiphone Triumph Regent. It is 17 and 3/8 inches wide, so a really proper old school jazz box built in New York. The pickup is not original, of course. It's a Crevo pickup that's a maker in Oregon. It was originally built as an acoustic guitar. I got it this past fall at Action Music in Virginia, and I love it. It sounds wonderful. That's the story on this guitar. Question from Jeremy, what's your favorite chord? It's hard to pick one. I would say my favorite chord progression, because really it's not about individual chords, it's about chord progressions. I love 1-6-2-5, which luckily for me is the most common chord progression in jazz, or next to the 2-5-1 progression is very common, something like this. So it's really not about individual chords, it's about groups of chords going together, and then it's about looking at how can this chord go to that chord? How do the individual notes move? Which is what we refer to as voice leading. So like working out that kind of thing is very exciting to me, and that's something that gets covered in some depth in the later units of the course. A question from Jim, do you get into block chords? Not necessarily, no. When we talk about block chords, that's usually referring to a specific way of voicing chords on the piano. And again, this class is not designed to be for any one instrument. So we don't really go into great depth on specific piano techniques or specific piano voicings beyond the general one- and two-handed voicings that I teach. Now, that said, the notes in block chords versus spread chords versus whatever are the same. So that is the kind of thing that would be handled on the individual instrument level a little more. Question from Victor, what model of guitar is that and what brand and gauge do you prefer for playing jazz? So I've talked about the model a little bit in terms of string. I'm sure he's referring to strings. It depends on the instrument. This guitar is currently strung with D'Addario Chrome's flat wound guitar strings, gauge 12. I don't know that I love them. I have another guitar with Tomastic flat wounds that are 13 on it. My electric guitar, I treat this primarily as an acoustic guitar. My electric guitar, I use GHS boomers 12 to 52. I do think for most jazz guitars, you really need to play a gauge of 0.11 or 0.12. I generally don't like flat wound strings on electric guitars. I do like them on acoustic guitars. That's my own preference, though. It's a very individual thing. But I do think there's a lot of truth in the fact that you want a heavier gauge string and you want a humbucking pickup to sound appropriate. A question from, forgive me, Akin Fullerin. I'm sorry, so sorry about how I'm pronouncing your name. Will there be any performance recordings we will have to turn in for the course? No, that's not part of it at current. The thing that you turn in are assignments. Now, that said, a lot of the assignments are things along the lines of composing a blues or composing a bass line. I would love for you to play these pieces yourself, but no, submitting performance videos of yourself on your instrument is not part of it at the moment, although that might be something for the future. A question from Nicholas, who is my favorite jazz guitarist? I will give you three. I love, for me, the trifecta is Jim Hall, Wes Montgomery, and Joe Pass. Joe Pass is, I would say, the person I've most modeled my own, certainly my own solo playing after. But Joe Pass, uh, uh, excuse me, Jim Hall has the kind of lyricism, introspection, the sophistication of someone like Bill Evans on the piano, but on the guitar. He's an absolutely beautiful player. And he has that kind of quietness and thoughtfulness to his playing that I love. Wes Montgomery has the incredible bop language, the incredible melodicism, so unbelievably swinging, all the fire of jazz guitar. And then Joe Pass, I love everything Joe Pass did, but I especially love him accompanying Ella Fitzgerald. A lot of people make a big deal out of the Virtuoso albums. Those are good. He's kind of overplaying a little bit, though. I love him accompanying Ella Fitzgerald. So for solo guitar and accompaniment, I love Joe Pass. And then, of course, in terms of people who are alive, Pat Metheny is the best there ever was, pretty much. He's unbelievable. Julian Lage is incredible. Nels Cline, I don't know how much people count him or don't count him, but I love Nels Cline. So there are, there's an embarrassment of riches with jazz guitarists out there. Last one from Reginald. When do we start? Anytime. You can sign up anytime. The class starts anytime. And once you're in, it's yours. So I think that is our last question. So I'd like to, again, thank everybody so much for being here. Thank you for listening. It means a lot to me. Of course, as I'm doing this, I'm speaking into my computer. I usually really rely on getting feedback in real time from the people I'm talking to. So I'd love to hear what you thought. I'd love to hear other questions, comments about the course. Feel free to email me again anytime. It's gprince, G-P-R-I-N-C-E @levinemusic.org. I'm always available. Please do download the syllabus, and I hope to have you in the class. So thank you so much for listening.